Hello, welcome to Focus on Ally Skills. I'm Valerie Aurora. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. So in this talk, we'll have about a 5-minute introduction, including definitions about ally skills. Then we'll spend about 10 minutes talking about why we should focus on ally skills. Then I'll describe about a dozen ally skills, give or take. And then I'll give you some instructions on how to learn more about ally skills. And if this were a live talk, then you would have 20 minutes of Q&A. A little bit more about me. My name is Valerie Aurora. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the founder of Frameshift Consulting, a diversity and inclusion in technology firm. I've taught ally skills to over 4,000 people around the world, including places like Spain, Sweden, Mexico, and across the US. Before that, I was a software developer in Linux and file systems for over 10 years. So what are ally skills? Let's start out with some terminology. So privilege is an unearned advantage given by society to some people, but not all. And the important point here is that it's unearned. Oppression is sort of what makes privilege possible. It's the background. It's widespread inequality. It's present throughout society. It helps people with more privilege and harms those with fewer privileges. So I noticed that sometimes people say, oh, I wonder why people bother with oppressing other people and systems of oppression. Seems like so much work. Well, the answer is because it makes life better for a privileged few. So a marginalized person then is a member of a group that is the main target of a system of oppression. So systems of oppression hurt a lot of people, but there's one group of people they hurt more than everyone else. That's marginalized people. Then an ally is someone who that society gives privilege to, that is doing two things. They're working to end oppression and understand their own privilege. So you notice these two things are actions. Let's talk a little bit more about actions and which of these things you are. So allyship is an action, not an identity. Being a marginalized person takes no action whatsoever. You can just sit there doing nothing and people will oppress you. Nothing you have to do. But being an ally is all about what you do. If you sit there doing nothing, you're not an ally. You're not fighting oppression. So that's why I prefer to talk about ally skills rather than allies. So you might be wondering which of these things you are. And the answer is, depending on the situation, you may switch back and forth between being a marginalized person and being able to take action as an ally. So I'll use myself as an example. As a white woman in the United States, if race is most important to a situation, then I'm more likely to be able to act as an ally. If my gender is more important to a situation, then I'm more likely to be a marginalized person who has relatively little power. So here's a practical example of these things at work. So here's a privilege you may have and not even know that you have. That's the ability to interview for a job and have the interviewer assume that if you have children, you will continue doing a good job at work. Oppression includes things like family expectations that mothers do more childcare, belief that mothers don't want to do paid work, financial systems that are unwilling to extend credit to mothers, laws that put more burdens on mothers than fathers, paying men more than women. Those are just a few examples. So there are people who are neither men nor women. They're called non-binary. And at this point, we don't have firm stereotypes about whether non-binary people are primary caregivers, whether they should spend most of their time on children or whether they should spend most of their time on work. I'm sure we will develop that. So a marginalized person would be any woman who wants to work for pay for an employer, regardless of her plans for children. That's the thing about systems of oppression, is they don't care about who you are individually. They just stereotype you based on your identity. All right, so within this whole system, an ally would be a man who does things like takes on significant childcare responsibilities, donates to women's causes, votes for feminist candidates and laws, and speaks up at work against stereotypes about mothers, and then reads news articles about privileges that fathers enjoy and mothers don't. So interesting, if you go look up the stats for the change in salary of new fathers versus new mothers. New fathers often get a small raise. New mothers often lose their jobs. Not such a great situation. All right, so there's your example. There's your main definitions. So here's my argument for this talk. What's wrong with diversity and inclusion today? I think that the problem is most work focuses on changing marginalized people and less work focuses on changing people with privilege. So, well, here's some examples of diversity and inclusion efforts, and you'll see what I mean here. So volunteer-run affinity groups are for marginalized people primarily. Travel scholarships to conferences, those are mostly aimed at marginalized people. Advice books, almost all at marginalized people. Conferences, here's one I was part of for women in computing. These are all aimed at marginalized groups. Okay, so here's a few reasons why we focus on changing marginalized people. I'm not saying they're good reasons, I'm just saying they're reasons. So first of all, marginalized people already want to make their lives better. And so if you say, hey, if we change this thing, your life will be better, it's an easy sell for people to improve diversity and inclusion when they will benefit from it. Marginalized people are often, but not always, more aware of their oppression already. So you don't have to do the initial education step of saying, hey, did you know that some people lose their jobs after they have children? You don't have to do the part where you raise the awareness of that oppression even exists. Marginalized people are often lower status and easier to tell what to do. So imagine you're in a meeting with your CEO and an intern you've just hired, and your CEO keeps interrupting your intern. What's easier to do? To say, hey, intern, you need to speak up for yourself? Or, hey, CEO, you need to stop interrupting? I know which one would be easier for me. Marginalized people are often seen as the cause of the problem. So there's a reasonably common proposal, which is maybe serious, maybe not serious, that one way to prevent sexual harassment at work would be to ban women from the office. So this ignores the fact that sexual harassment occurs among people of all genders, but the interesting thing here is that most sexual harassment is perpetrated by men, and it would make much more sense to ban men from the workplace, but nobody ever suggests that because women are seen as the cause of the problem of sexual harassment. Finally, it lets privileged people avoid thinking about their unearned advantages. So it's, if you say, oh, we need to convince marginalized people how to negotiate better, we can ignore the fact that privileged people are getting way more salary for no good reason, not for any reason that they earned. All right, so here is my argument for why we should not focus on changing marginalized people. So the first important point is that marginalized people are already overworked. Here's a shot of Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. There's a comment saying that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, just backwards and in high heels. So whether or not this is literally true, there's a lot of research showing that marginalized people are affected by the prove it again bias. So the prove it again bias says that people forget when marginalized people behave in ways that are against stereotype. So often a marginalized person will demonstrate their competence over and over and over again. People will just keep forgetting it over and over again. You just have to keep doing way more work. So this is one of the biases in the book, What Works for Women at Work, which is by Joan C. Williams and Rachel Dempsey. This is the only book of advice for marginalized people I recommend, because for two reasons. One, it presents its advice in the context of you're not going to solve sexism yourself as a woman, but you could make things easier for yourself, which is true. And the other reason I like it is that more than half of the women they interviewed for this book were women of color. Marginalized people are under more stress. So discrimination and harassment at work cause a lot of stress and make life very difficult. The abuse and assault is people are becoming more aware of, with much more in the workplace, much more reporting on the experiences of women, people of color, disabled people, all sorts of people at work. What happens after multiple years or particularly bad experiences is post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can imagine all of these things make it really difficult to, fix systemic oppression. Marginalized people have less money. So lesbian couples, so just a few random statistics. This is just true across the board, but I just love pulling out some statistics. So lesbian couples, women in lesbian couples make 79% of what men married to women make. White women make 78% of what white men make. Mothers make 73% of what fathers make. Black women make 65% of what white men make. People with disabilities make 63% of what those without disabilities make. And Latinos make 58% of what white men make. This is in the United States. Every time I give this talk in another country, I can easily find another set of statistics showing that marginalized people are making less money in that country. Marginalized people risk retaliation when they act. So here's, and I've seen this a lot in my own life, but here's an experiment. Researchers found that when marginalized people work to increase diversity, supervisors give them worse performance reviews. But when more privileged people work to increase diversity, it does not harm their performance reviews and may actually improve them. So I think we shouldn't be asking marginalized people to harm their careers further. We should be asking the people who can do it without harm. Marginalized people are often in the minority, not always. This is not always the case, but it does become true as the more people, the higher up you go in a hierarchy, and the more a job is compensated. So here's just one example of many. The gender of Wikipedia editors in English. I don't recommend doing your gender survey the way they did. Send the email to get more about it. But you look at this, and 90% of the people editing Wikipedia are men. So I look at this and I say, oh, we could ask the 10% of people who are not men to do a bunch of work, or we could ask the men to do a bunch of work. I know which one I would choose. Marginalized people have less power and influence. So just as a few examples, among Fortune 500 CEOs, the last time I checked, fewer than 8% are women, fewer than 1% are Black, and fewer than 1% are openly queer in some way. Related, a study looked at the management team of S&P 1500 companies. Management team includes the C-suite and the board of directors. And they found that the probability that a woman occupies a top management team position is 51% lower if another woman holds a position on the same team. So what this is saying is that tokenism is real. Sometimes there can be only one. And the reason is not because women or Black people or anyone else are so competitive or anything else. It's because the people in power decide that there can be only one. Marginalized people are often seen as biased and selfish when they are acting to improve conditions for their own group. So this is an accusation I've seen over and over and over again. Someone will say, oh, you're just complaining about racism or ableism or transphobia because you personally did not get the job or the promotion or the award that you wanted. And this just comes out over and over again, no matter how accomplished a marginalized person is. You can go all the way up to the Supreme Court and people will still be accusing you of this. And yet, when you look at the organizations out there to support marginalized people in tech, which is my main area of expertise, you see that it's mostly aimed at changing the behavior of marginalized people. So Black Girls Code, Callback Women, Natives Who Code, Lesbians Who Tech, Trans Hack, Pregnant Scholar, Code 2040, Mother Coders. These are all aimed at marginalized people. And of course, there is the grandmother of them all, the Lean In book, which does make the claim, if women just work harder, women can end systemic sexism. That is definitely not true, and Sheryl Sandberg has retracted some of her claims in this book. So in contrast, here's some resources for developing ally skills. There are three things I've put out: the Ally Skills Workshop, the Frameshift Twitter account, some other materials on our website, and Better Allies, which is by Karen Catlin, and they have an Twitter account, Better Allies. There's not a lot of stuff out there. All right, so my proposal is this year, we should focus on ally skills instead of teaching marginalized people how to be faster, better, harder. So here are my reasons why. Allies have more time and energy, just from recapping from the opposite position. Allies have more money. Allies are less likely to be harmed when they take action. Allies are often, but not always, in the majority. Allies have more power and influence, and allies are seen as altruistic, giving, and kind when they do this work. So I've talked about why allies should take action. So what do good ally skills look like? I'll review a few of them. An ally self-educates. So it's before you go ask a real live marginalized person something, go ask yourself, hey, could somebody send me a let me Google that for you link that answers my question? Basically, can you just search for the answer to your question on the internet and will you get the answer? So a good example here is if you want to know that if your country is imprisoning people based on race at disproportionate amounts, you can just look that up on the internet and you'll find out that racialized people are disproportionately imprisoned in almost every country in the world. An ally listens and passes the microphone. So this is saying that most of the time, not always, we'll talk about when to speak up, but an ally should stop talking and listen and amplify the voices of marginalized people. This is partly because privileged people are used to getting to say what they want. They're used to being listened to, and it takes an act of will to become aware of that and oppose it. So here's an example of somebody doing this. Alan Eustace was a senior vice president at Google back in 2014 at the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing. This event featured a male allies panel with several executives from other large tech companies, and it was a complete disaster because the people in the audience knew a lot more about this. I think it was about 7,000 women. So after this minor disaster, Alan Eustace put out this tweet. He said, "Let's reverse the male allies panel. You talk, I listen." And then he gave the room information. Then he and most of the other executives showed up to this room and listened while women came to the microphone one by one and shared their experience of working for tech companies and in some cases working for their own the companies of the executives. So that was a great example of listening and literally giving people the microphone. An ally gives credit scrupulously. So another great thing that happens as somebody with a lot of privilege is people will just assume that you did the important, difficult thing. So this will happen even when you, as the most powerful person in the room, do not ask for credit. So it's really important to be careful about giving credit and to give credit very as often as possible to marginalized people. People often think, oh, well, this is just being selfish or self-centered or something like that. No, you are opposing oppression when you do this. So here's a great example of a norm that developed within the social justice community. Whenever we talk about the concept of intersectionality, which is the idea that multiple systems of oppression interact and intersect with each other and produce fascinating new kinds of oppression. This was coined by the legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw, and we try to always credit her by name when we talk about it. To give an example, Kimberlé Crenshaw is herself a Black woman. She gets oppression for being Black, she gets oppression for being a woman, and she gets a different, separate, unique kind of oppression for being a Black woman called misogynoir. An ally asks for consent whenever possible. So often making progress in social justice requires individual marginalized people facing a lot of difficulty and stress. The important thing here is that if you are not that actual marginalized person, you should, as much as possible, ask for consent before putting the marginalized person in that position. It's not always possible, but when you can, you should. So an example of this is the fight for marriage equality. So in most places around the world, the right for people of the same gender to marry each other involved a lot of court cases where individual same-sex couples went to court for their right to get married. And each of these couples suffered a lot of people harassing them, writing mean newspaper articles about private details of their lives. And of course, they had to go to court a whole bunch. It's not a great situation. The important thing is that each of these same-sex couples chose to do this, and were not forced to by some random heterosexual person. All right, an ally keeps the focus on marginalized people. So an interesting situation that happens again with being privileged is people really want to turn the conversation to you, and you are used to the conversation being about you and your feelings. There's a Twitter account that makes fun of this called Birds Rights Activist. And I love this tweet. It is, I feel uncomfortable when we are not about me. So I like to remember that as a reminder that it doesn't have to be about me. But I want to give another example about this. It happened to me recently. So somebody was complaining on the Facebook for my apartment building in San Francisco about somebody accusing them of being anti-Asian for their behavior in an elevator in our building. This is in the context of a wave that is still ongoing of anti-Asian violence in our city and around the world as a result of COVID. This person was really, really upset because they felt their behavior was not motivated by anti-Asian racism and it was misinterpreted. So I responded and said, I feel sorry that your actions were mistaken for anti-Asian racism, and I feel even more sorry for the person who experienced so much anti-Asian racism that they interpret it that way. Let's focus on fighting anti-Asian racism because that's the more important thing. So I can acknowledge this person's feelings and then turn the conversation back towards the marginalized people. An ally speaks up when it's unpopular. So this is the case where you don't want to be quiet and listen and pass the microphone. It's when if you speak up, you're going to get a negative reaction because you are saying something that's difficult for people to hear. So here's an example I found on the internet. Mukta Kulkarni talked about realizing that his being ignorant of his caste privilege when he lived in India made it hard for him to see racism in the United States when he moved to the United States. So he was taking up two things. He was talking about casteism and racism in the United States. This did not get him a lot of fans, but it was really important for him to use his privilege here to talk about these difficult things. So he's talking specifically about anti-Black racism, so acting as an ally to Black people. All right, an ally uses their energy wisely. So the internet is filled with trolls, and some of them are even just automatic computer programs, not even people. There's no point in arguing with them. There's no point in arguing even with the humans. So here are some rules that you can use to not waste your time. So Charles' rules of argument were created by Charles Miller, who had a blog on the internet and needed to find a way to stop spending so much time arguing with random people. So his first rule is don't go looking for an argument. There's going to be arguments in your sphere of influence where people know who you are and respect your opinion. So when I was talking about speaking up on the Facebook group for my apartment building, people respect me in my apartment building because I run the garden. So that's don't go looking because there's somebody wrong on the internet somewhere. If you do choose to have an argument, state your position once, speaking to the audience. So often somebody who's just done something terrible is not open to changing their mind. But somebody who's just watching will be wondering, like, oh, do we make homophobic jokes around here? I don't know. And if you say, we don't make homophobic jokes here, they're going to be like, right, I believe you. So speaking to the audience is really important. The next step is to wait for absurd replies where people either intentionally or unintentionally misunderstand you. And then you reply one time to correct any genuine misunderstandings of your first statement. And then here's the hard part, do not reply again. And then go do something you like instead, like playing with your kids or walking your dog or drinking a beer, whatever it is that's going to give you more energy for the next argument. All right, an ally spends money. So nobody ever feels like they have too much money. I read something saying that basically every single person in the world, no matter how rich they are, thinks they need about twice as much money as they actually have in order to feel safe. But here's what you can think about is, remember the statistics showing that marginalized people generally make less money than people with more privilege. However much money you have, it's more than somebody who is more marginalized than you on average. So the amount of money that doesn't seem like a lot to you can actually make a big difference. So it's a great thing to spend money at businesses owned by marginalized people, to invest in marginalized people, to donate to nonprofits that are supporting marginalized people, all that sort of stuff. An ally uses their social capital. So as somebody with privilege, you have access to a social network full of people with similar privileges and power and influence and all that. One of the things you can do with social capital is you can actually share it with other people by inviting somebody to the dinner that's only for the people who with the most power in your organization, or saying, hey, maybe we should stop having ski trips and instead we should do something that's more accessible to people who didn't grow up very wealthy. The nice thing about social capital is that you can often grow it by using it to fight oppression. So if we combine it with the principle of an ally spends money, for example, you can start a group fundraising drive where you match donations to a nonprofit. And this often greatly increases your social capital because people think you're a great person. Also, you raise more money that way. Talk to your local nonprofit. An ally acts even when it's uncomfortable. So I love this dog. This dog is so cute and it's being so good. So one of the things I find is that people are just really, really uncomfortable when they're witnessing some kind of social injustice or oppression, or microaggression or whatever, even if they're not the target of it. And here's what I try to tell people about the situations. Hey, if you feel this uncomfortable, imagine how uncomfortable it feels to actually be the target of what just happened. That is what really helps me take action. It's like, I might feel weird, but at least it's not the 1000th time that somebody has told me personally that I'm inferior. So that's a good reason to speak up. An ally sacrifices personal gain sometimes. As somebody with more privilege and power, you're going to get more opportunities. And one of the things you can do is try to share those and distribute them to other people, which means that you're giving up something for yourself. So one of the examples that comes up a lot is panels. So an all-male panel is unfortunately quite common. There's a Twitter account called All Male Panels that finds these. All white panels are really common as well. You'll see a lot of all white male panels. So I, as a white person, whenever I'm invited to be on a panel, I ask first thing. I say, hey, are there any people of color on this panel? And if the answer is no, then I say, hey, here are 2 or 3 people of color who are more qualified than me that should be on your panel instead of me. You don't have to do this with the first panel you're ever invited to, but around the time of your 10th panel, it's something you should think about. This goes for speaking at a conference. It's really embarrassing to be one of the 60 white speakers at a conference. All right, an ally follows leaders from marginalized groups. So again, somebody with power and privilege, people are likely to follow you, do what you say, give you money. I see this in the form of computer programmers showing up and saying, hey, everybody, I built you an app. And if they're not part of that marginalized group, inevitably, that's not the app they need. So the thing is that there's already people out there who are members of marginalized groups who are leading, who know what they need and are asking for help and have made it easy for you to support them, either through money or volunteer time, or spreading the word or giving them media attention, all that sort of stuff. So find and follow leaders from marginalized groups. A great example of this is a saying in disability activism, nothing about us without us. This is the concept that if people are trying to do something to support disabled people, then disabled people should be part of that work. An example would be if somebody is writing legislation to improve wheelchair access to public buildings, people who use wheelchairs should be part of rewriting that legislation. There's a great documentary talking about this, this sort of self-advocacy or self-leadership amongst the disability community called Crip Camp. It's on Netflix. It was nominated for an Academy Award. It's actually not at all depressing and quite inspiring. I highly recommend it. One other note, people often argue about whether to say disabled people or people with disabilities. There's a disagreement within the group of disabled people. I personally use disabled people. Ask the people you're working with and see what they prefer. All right, final ally skill. An ally makes mistakes and apologizes. So if you wait until you're perfect to start acting as an ally, you will never act as an ally. Nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. What you're trying to do is start out with small mistakes and then move up in your actions as you become more accomplished and knowledgeable. And then when you do make mistakes, you just acknowledge your mistake, apologize, correct yourself, move on. Oftentimes I see people in a position to act as an ally, making mistakes and then turning the entire conversation into them and how their feelings and how bad they feel and how they're such a great person, they can't believe they did that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is called making it about you. So it's much better to briefly apologize, correct yourself, move on as much as possible. All right, so there's no way that you actually learned all those ally skills. Here are some ways to get a bunch of practice and to ramp up your ally skills. So if you follow Frameshift LLC on Twitter, it's pretty low traffic. I mostly just retweet 4 or 5 times a day helpful topics around ally skills. Dear Ally Skills Teacher is an advice column going into more detail on specific questions. And you can attend an ally skills workshop. I teach these at organizations and very, very, very occasionally teach them publicly. All right, I want to summarize. Here's what I hope you will take away. Most diversity and inclusion efforts focus on changing marginalized people, but allies have more time, energy, power, and influence to make change. Ally skills can be learned, and we should focus on teaching ally skills to people with more power, privilege, and influence. All right, if this was a live talk, I would now answer a bunch of questions. Thank you for watching this and check out our website.